The night of March 9th into March 10th, 1945, came to Tokyo dry and hard with wind. The city had not seen meaningful rain in weeks. Along the low wards east of the Imperial Palace, in Asakusa and Honjo and Fukagawa, the houses stood close together, wood and paper and tile, packed so tightly that a person could pass a bowl of rice from one window to the next without stepping into the lane. Just after midnight, four aircraft crossed the sky above those wards and dropped clusters of bombs that burst into flame on contact, laying down two intersecting lines of fire in the shape of a great burning letter. What the men in those first aircraft had drawn was an aiming mark. The bombers behind them, more than 270 in all, were told to fill the inside of that mark with fire. They did. By dawn, 16 square miles of the largest city on Earth had been reduced to ash, and somewhere between 80,000 and over 100,000 people were dead. The men who held responsibility for defending that city, the generals of the Eastern District Army and the air divisions assigned to the capital, watched it happen. The record of what they said is not what the title of this account might lead you to expect. If this story is pulling you in, take a second to hit the like button and subscribe, and drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. It means a great deal to know who's listening, to understand what the Japanese high command said that night. And, in the months that followed, it helps to begin not in Tokyo, but on 3 small islands in the Pacific, and with an American general who had been told, in plain terms, that he was running out of time. In the summer of 1944, the United States Marines and soldiers had taken Saipan, Tinian, and Guam from the Japanese and the Mariana Islands. Those islands mattered for one reason above all others. From airfields built on them, the newest heavy bomber in the American inventory could reach Tokyo and return. That bomber was the B-29 Superfortress, an aircraft with a range of more than 3,000 miles and a service ceiling above 30,000 feet, designed to fly so high that most fighters could not climb to meet it and to place its bombs with precision from the edge of the stratosphere. It was the most complex machine the United States built during the war, requiring the effort of factories across the country to produce. The first sustained raids flown from the Marianas, beginning in late November of 1944, marked the first time in history that aircraft had crossed an ocean to bomb an enemy capital, and the first American aircraft over Tokyo since the Doolittle Raiders had passed over the city in 1942. They accomplished almost nothing. The bombers climbed to 30,000 feet and found a problem no one had planned for. At that altitude over Japan, a band of wind that meteorologists would later call the jet stream blew at speeds approaching 250 miles per hour. Bombs released into that wind were carried far from their targets and fell into open fields and into the sea. The bombers themselves, flying into the same wind on their approach, burned through fuel at a rate that left some of them unable to reach home, ditching in the Pacific on the way back. Cloud cover to the rest. On an average month, the skies over Japan offered only about 7 clear days. American crews were flying thousands of miles, risking their lives, and hitting almost nothing. The accuracy of those high-altitude attacks has been measured by historians at well under 20% on target, and against some objectives far lower than that. In January of 1945, command of the bomber force responsible for this campaign, the 21st Bomber Command, passed to Major General Curtis LeMay. He was 38 years old. He had run bomber operations in Europe and then in China, and he understood that the men flying these missions were doing everything asked of them. The method was what kept failing. He also understood his own position. His predecessor had been relieved for failing to produce results, and LeMay knew that if he did not find a way to make the B-29 work against Japan, he would be relieved as well. The strategic bombing of Japan had been sold to Washington as the alternative to an invasion of the home islands, an invasion that planners estimated could cost hundreds of thousands of American casualties. The bomber had to deliver. For weeks it did not. LeMay's early missions looked exactly like the ones that had failed before him. He studied the failures, and he reached a conclusion that ran against everything American bomber doctrine had taught. The doctrine was built on precision, on daylight, on altitude, on tight defensive formations bristling with machine guns. LeMay decided to throw all of it away. His reasoning rested on a few hard observations. The high-altitude winds were defeating his bombing, so he would come in low, between 5,000 and 7,000 feet, where the jet stream had no effect and accuracy improved. The cloud cover that ruined daylight raids was thinner and the weather calmer at night, and the radio navigation systems his crews used worked better after dark, so he would attack at night. Flying low and at night, individually rather than in formation, his bombers could not have held formation in the dark anyway, would save enormous quantities of fuel, and that saved fuel could be traded for bombs. American intelligence had concluded that Japan possessed only a small night fighter force and limited low-altitude anti-aircraft capability. LeMay took that intelligence at its word and made a decision that troubled some of his own crews and staff. He ordered the defensive machine guns and the gunners who operated them stripped from the bombers, all but the tail position, to save still more weight for bombs. Bomber crews tended to be close, and leaving the gunners behind sat badly with the men. The intelligence officers of the command predicted that as many as 70% of the aircraft could be lost in such an attack. LeMay consulted a senior officer on the air staff about the new tactics, but did not formally seek the approval of his own superior, General Henry Arnold, who headed the Air Forces, later explaining that he had wanted to shield Arnold from blame if the raid failed. He sent the order on a day he knew Arnold and his chief of staff would be away. He could not fly the mission himself, because he had been briefed on the development of the atomic bomb and could not be allowed to risk capture, so he handed the lead in the air to Brigadier General Thomas Power, whom he considered the best of his wing commanders. The bombs themselves were the other half of the decision. Against the stone and concrete cities of Germany, American bombers had used high-explosive ordnance to good effect. Against Japan, high-explosive bombs had performed poorly. Japanese cities were built of wood and paper. What burned a wooden city was fire. The weapon the Americans had developed for that purpose was the M69, a small incendiary bomblet filled with a jellied gasoline mixture known as napalm. Dropped in clusters from the bomb bays of the B-29s, the bomblets scattered across rooftops, and a fuse first sprayed the burning napalm and then ignited it, throwing fire across everything it touched. The Americans had not arrived at this weapon by guesswork. As early as 1943, they had built full-scale replicas of German and Japanese domestic housing at a proving ground in the Utah desert, furnished them as real homes would be furnished, and burned them down again and again to learn exactly how each kind of neighborhood caught fire. The tests showed that the M69 was particularly good at starting fires that could not be put out. The Americans then rehearsed the method in combat. They burned part of the occupied Chinese city of Hankow in December. They sent incendiaries against Nagoya in early January, and against Kobe in February, where bombs from 69 aircraft destroyed or damaged more than 1,000 buildings. On the 25th of February, they ran a large daylight incendiary attack on Tokyo itself, a high-altitude raid that nonetheless burned out nearly 28,000 buildings and convinced LeMay that fire, properly delivered, was the answer he had been looking for. None of this was wholly improvised. American planners had studied the feasibility of burning Japan cities as far back as 1943, and the overall plan for the bombing campaign had always assumed a shift from the precision bombing of factories to the area bombing of cities at roughly the halfway point, a turn forecast for about March of 1945. The planners had run the numbers in advance. They estimated that incendiary attacks on Japan's 6 largest cities could damage close to 40% of the country's industrial capacity, kill more than 500,000 people, and leave nearly 8 million homeless. No one treated the figures as a warning. They read as a forecast of success. On the 8th of March, LeMay issued the order for a maximum effort firebombing attack on Tokyo the following night. Across the bombing campaign, the load each superfortress could carry now roughly doubled because of the weight saved by flying low, at night, and without guns. The target was a rectangle in the northeast of the city that the Americans designated Zone 1, about 4 miles long and 3 miles wide, divided by the Sumida River, taking in the densely built working wards of Asakusa, Honjo, and Fukagawa. These were part of the old downtown that Tokyo called the Shitamachi, the Low City, home to laborers and craftsmen and small tradespeople. Roughly 1.1 million people lived inside that rectangle. It was one of the most crowded patches of urban ground anywhere on Earth. The district had burned before, in the Great Earthquake of 1923, when fire had killed tens of thousands in these same streets, and American intelligence knew how vulnerable it remained. The Office of Strategic Services had raided at the most combustible district in the city. The Americans had built their picture of Tokyo carefully. The first superfortress had flown over the city in early November of 1944, a single reconnaissance aircraft photographing the industrial areas and the dense wards below, and the flights that followed had mapped the rest of the city. From those photographs, the planners had drawn the target zones, ward by ward, and chosen the patch of the low city where fire would do the most. By the night of the raid, they knew the ground beneath them better than many of the people who would die on it. American planners had also determined, correctly, that this district held a dense web of the small workshops and home factories that fed components into Japan's larger war industries, which gave the area its standing as a military target, even as the orders for the raid acknowledged that the attack would kill civilians on a vast scale and that this was understood to be part of how it would disrupt Japanese production. Now consider the other side of that approaching night, the side the title of this account asks about. What did the men responsible for defending Tokyo know, and what did they believe in the hours before the fire came? The defense of the capital rested with the Eastern District Army, commanded by General Shizuchi Tanaka, and within that command the air defense of the Kanto Plain around Tokyo was given the highest priority for aircraft and guns in all of Japan. On paper, the apparatus looked substantial. The 1st Anti-Aircraft Division controlled the guns defending Central Honshu, 8 regiments fielding around 780 anti-aircraft guns together with a regiment of searchlights. American intelligence estimated that something over 600 of those guns, a mix of heavy and light pieces, were assigned to Tokyo itself. The 10th Air Division was responsible for intercepting raids on the region, with roughly 210 combat aircraft. A network of picket boats at sea, radar stations, and lookout posts was meant to give early warning of any incoming attack. The Japanese command was not blind to the danger. They had expected that the Americans would eventually make major night attacks on the Tokyo region. Through December and January, they had watched small night raids probe the capital, and the 10th Air Division had begun pushing its pilots to train for night operations, converting one of its regiments, the 53rd Air Regiment, into a specialized night fighter unit. The conversion did not go well. The regiment fielded only around 25 night fighters, and the training program meant to ready its pilots was so intense that it left them worn out rather than sharp. On the night of the 3rd into the 4th of March, just days before the Great Raid, Japanese listeners had even intercepted American radio traffic that told them the Bomber Command was running a major night flying exercise, which they correctly read as preparation for large-scale night attacks. The warning signs were there, and the command saw them. What the command did not anticipate was the single decision that mattered most. They did not imagine that the Americans would come in low. Every assumption in the Japanese air defense system was built around the B-29 as it had behaved for months, a high-altitude raider crossing above 30,000 feet. The radar was tuned to find aircraft up high. The guns were sighted for high targets. The fighters were trained and positioned to climb after a high-altitude enemy. There was a further problem, one rooted in success rather than failure. In early January, a firebombing attempt against Nagoya had been brought under control by Japanese firefighters before it could spread. That outcome had bred a dangerous confidence in the Japanese authorities, a belief that their cities could absorb incendiary attack and that their defenses and fire brigades were equal to the threat. They had measured the danger against a fire they had managed to put out and concluded the danger was manageable. They were about to learn how wrong that measurement had been. Beneath the military command sat a civil defense system that was, for a city of Tokyo's size, almost an illusion of protection. The fire department numbered around 8,000 men spread among some 287 stations, with little modern equipment and tactics that were useless against napalm. By one account, there were only 3 extension ladders in the entire city. Civilians had been organized into well over 100,000 neighborhood firefighting associations, millions of people on paper, equipped with hand pumps, buckets, and wet straw mats, none of which could do anything against the M69. Real air raid shelters had barely been built. The government had judged that constructing proper shelters would damage public morale, would amount to an admission that the capital could be bombed at all, and so most households had only crude holes dug near their homes. More than 200,000 houses had been pulled down to create fire breaks, but the rubble was often left in place, where it would serve as fuel rather than as a barrier. The government had encouraged the evacuation of children and non-essential workers, and some 1.7 million people had left the city. But many others had moved in from the impoverished countryside, and the working wards remained packed. The wind that night blew hard from the southeast, gusting, by the records kept in the city, somewhere between 45 and 67 miles per hour. Everything the Americans needed was in place, and almost nothing the defenders needed was. The attacking force began lifting off from the Marianas at 35 minutes past 5 in the afternoon on the 9th of March. It took nearly 3 hours for all of the more than 320 bombers dispatched to get into the air. Getting that many aircraft ready had taken an extraordinary effort on the ground. The maintenance crews in the Marianas had worked through a stretch of about 36 hours to push the number of flyable B-29s far above the usual rate, so that more than 8 in 10 of the bombers were available, against a normal figure closer to 6 in 10. The first aircraft over the target were loaded with a heavier napalm bomb, the kind that started fires fierce enough to require mechanized equipment to fight, and the bombers behind them carried clusters of the smaller M69. The aircraft based closest to Japan each carried 7 tons of bombs, while those staging from farther away carried 5, the difference made up in fuel for the longer flight. The crews met turbulence on the long flight north, but the weather over Tokyo was good, the sky mostly clear, and the first crews to arrive could see for 10 miles. The first aircraft over the city, shortly before midnight, were 4 guide bombers that carried no bombs at all, only extra fuel, extra radios, and the command's best radio operators, and they circled high above the city throughout the raid in a coordination scheme that proved unnecessary and was later judged a waste. Behind them came the Pathfinders, crewed by the best navigators in the force. Coming in from angles set at right angles to one another, they laid down the burning cross of incendiaries that marked the target for everyone who followed. The main attack began at 8 minutes past midnight on the 10th of March. General Power circled the city for 90 minutes in his superfortress while his mapmakers charted the spread of the fire below him. What happened over the next 2 hours and 40 minutes is recorded in the after-action reports of the Bomber Command, in the accounts of the air crews, and in the memory of the people of Tokyo who lived through it. The bombers came on in a stream, each crew briefed to drop into a different portion of the marked zone so that the fire would spread evenly across the whole district. The incendiaries fell by the thousand. Driven by the wind, the small fires they started did not stay small. They reached toward one another, merged, and within half an hour of the first bombs the situation had passed beyond anything the fire department could touch. An hour into the raid, the firemen stopped trying to fight the fire at all and turned to guiding people out and pulling the trap from collapsing buildings. More than 125 firemen and several hundred civil guards assigned to help them were killed, and nearly 100 fire engines were destroyed. The merging fires became a firestorm, a single mass of flame that generated its own wind, drawing air inward and upward with such force that the heat in places reached temperatures historians have estimated at around 1800 degrees Fahrenheit. The storm threw the bombers around the sky. The rising columns of superheated air created turbulence, so violent that B-29s were tossed up and down by as much as 1,000 feet, and in some cases the updrafts flipped the heavy aircraft onto their backs. The crews, realizing they were inverted only when loose gear crashed down around them, and the fires that had been below them an instant before were suddenly above. At ground level, the ordinary rules of survival no longer applied. People who stayed in their homes to fight the fire had no chance. The clothing on a person's back could burst into flame from the radiant heat alone, without the fire ever touching them. Glass in windows softened and ran, and the cyclonic wind picked up the liquefied glass and the burning air and carried them through the streets, where the molten glass fell on people like rain and burned in a hair and skin. The crude shelters dug beside the houses became ovens. People who sheltered in them were suffocated as the firestorm pulled the oxygen out of the air, or were simply baked where they crouched. The instinct that killed the most people was the instinct to flee toward water and toward open ground. Tokyo had created large parks as refuges after the great earthquake, and thousands of people ran for them, and the fire crossed the open spaces and killed them where they gathered. At the grounds of the Sensoji Temple in Asakusa, a place that had stood as a sanctuary in the city's life for centuries, thousands died. Where a bridge crossed the Sumida River, the Kototoi Bridge, a crowd of fleeing civilians was caught in the open when the full bomb load of a single aircraft came down among them, and hundreds were burned to death in one place. Escape was often impossible. The smoke cut visibility to a few feet, and the roads filled with fire faster than people could move along them. Families tried to stay together and to keep with their neighborhood associations, but in the dark and the smoke and the crush of bodies, almost no family managed to remain whole through the night. Crowds rushing toward the perceived safety of the canals trampled those who fell, and the panic itself became a cause of death. People ran for the canals and the river. Some survived in the water. Others were crushed in the crowds that surged toward it, or drowned, or died when the firestorm passed over the water and took the air. There was a school in the district, the Futaba School, known for its large swimming pool and its solid brick buildings, and people flocked to it believing it would protect them. In the morning, the rescuers found the brick buildings full of the dead, baked rather than burned, and the pool, which had been full of water the night before, was empty and dry. The water boiled away, and the bodies of more than 1,000 people who had climbed into it were found at the bottom. This is the kind of detail that does not appear in the communiques. It survives in the recovery records, in the counts kept by the men who had to collect the dead, and in the accounts of the few who lived. The fire finally burned itself out in the late morning of the 10th, dying only when it reached the wide canals and the open ground that gave it nothing more to consume. By then, most of Eastern Tokyo was gone. As the bombers worked over the city, the smell of what was happening below reached them at altitude. Crews opening their bomb bay doors reported a stench rising through the aircraft that some of them, men who had flown many missions, would never forget, and some had to put on their oxygen masks to keep flying. One bombardier later described how the odor of burning flesh filled the airplane through the open bomb bay, so strong that the smell clung to the aircraft and the flight suits for days afterward. If this is the kind of history you want more of, subscribe and turn on notifications. There's far more in the record still to cover. Your support is what keeps these stories coming. Now to the question the title raises directly. With the city burning beneath them, where was the Japanese command, and what did it do, and what did it say? The honest answer begins with a failure so complete that it reads almost as absence. Tokyo's defenders were expecting an attack, and yet they did not detect the American force until it was already over the city. The picket boats at sea did spot the bombers coming in, but poor radio reception meant most of their reports never reached the commands ashore, and the reports that did arrive ran into a defense organization too disorganized to act on them. Around midnight, a small number of B-29s had been picked up near Katsura on the coast, but they were taken for reconnaissance flights of the kind the Americans had been running for months. When aircraft were detected flying at low altitude, the reports were not believed because the radar operators and the command were looking for an enemy up high, where the B-29 had always been. The radar stations kept their attention on the upper sky. The first public alarm that a raid was underway was sounded at 1:15 midnight, after the bombs had already begun to fall. By the time the 10th Air Division got its night fighters into the air and the anti-aircraft division brought its guns and searchlights into action, the fire was already taking hold. The defense that followed was, in the words of the historical record, ineffective, and it was ineffective in ways that traced directly back to the command's misjudgment. The anti-aircraft fire was heavy in places, but much of it was aimed at altitudes above or below the bombers, sighted for a high-altitude enemy that had not come. As the fires spread, gun positions were overrun by the flames and fell silent, and the volume of fire dropped over the course of the night. The night fighters received no useful direction from the radar stations, and there was no coordination between the fighter units and the gunners, so that the two halves of the defense worked blind and apart. Across the entire raid, American crews reported only a few dozen sightings of Japanese fighters and a smaller number of actual attacks. Not one B-29 was brought down by a Japanese fighter that night. Some Japanese pilots died when their own aircraft ran out of fuel and crashed, having found nothing to shoot at. The guns did better than the fighters. Japanese anti-aircraft gunners shot down 12 of the bombers and damaged more than 40 others, 2 of which were later written off. Of the 12 that went down, 5 managed to reach the sea and ditch, and their crews were pulled from the water by American submarines waiting offshore for exactly that purpose. 96 American airmen were killed or went missing, and 6 were wounded. For the destruction of the largest city in Japan, those were the losses the defense was able to impose. The intelligence LeMay had relied on, that Japan's low altitude and night defenses were weak, had proved correct, and the gamble he had taken in stripping his bombers of their guns had cost him a small fraction of the aircraft his own officers had feared he would lose. The mechanism of the catastrophe followed from the meeting of an American decision the Japanese had not prepared for, with a Japanese assumption the Americans had correctly judged. LeMay had read the weakness in the defense and built his entire plan around exploiting it. The Japanese command had read the danger of night attack, but had anchored every preparation to the wrong altitude, and had let a single firefighting success at Nagoya convince them that fire was a manageable threat. When the test came, the apparatus that looked substantial on paper, the 600 guns, the 200 aircraft, the picket line and the radar net, accomplished almost nothing against the thing that actually arrived. So what did the general say? On the day of the raid, the body that spoke for the Japanese military, the Imperial General Headquarters, issued a communique. It did not describe a firestorm. It did not name a death toll. It stated that various places within the city had been set afire. That was the public word from the High Command on the morning after the most destructive air attack in the history of warfare. It was a minimization so severe that it amounted to a kind of silence. The government first tried to suppress the true extent of what had happened, and then it changed course, choosing to let the press emphasize the scale of the destruction, not to tell the truth for its own sake, but to turn public anger against the United States. The stories ran on the front pages of the newspapers on the 11th of March, focused on the perceived cruelty of the attack and on the number of American aircraft the defenders claimed to have shot down. The casualty figures were left vague. The few photographs that ran showed little of the real damage. When the state broadcaster reported the raid, it reached for a phrase that carried the emotional truth even as the official communique buried the physical one, and called it slaughter bombing. Alongside this, the government turned to repression, setting heavy penalties for anyone accused of disloyalty or of spreading rumors about the true extent of the destruction, and mounting a campaign to restore confidence in the country's air and civil defenses. The measures did not work. The morale of the people had been broken in a way no communique could mend, and for many of the survivors the firebombing was the moment they understood that the war was lost, whatever the government chose to say. There is a strange symmetry in how the attack was reported on the other side of the Pacific. American newspapers, working from the bomber command's own communiques rather than from any censorship, told their readers about the physical destruction of Tokyo, the square miles burned, the buildings flattened, and said almost nothing about the human cost. They printed no estimate of the dead. The scale of the killing was, for different reasons, left out of the accounts on both sides of the war, the Japanese government burying it to protect its own standing, the American press simply not being given the figures. The most honest statements from the Japanese military side came later, after the war was over, when American investigators with the United States Strategic Bombing Survey sat down with senior Japanese officers and officials through the autumn of 1945 and asked them what the bombing had done. That survey had been ordered to measure the effect of air power on Japan, and its officers spent the closing months of the year interviewing the men who had run the Japanese war effort. The work was difficult. Many of the officers best placed to explain what had happened were dead. Many of the records had been burned in the very air raids the survey was studying, or destroyed and hidden at the surrender. The investigators had to bring the surviving officers to Tokyo from across Japan and question them with almost no original documents to work from. But the men who sat in those rooms had nothing left to protect, and stripped of the need to defend morale, their answers were direct. A Japanese army officer told the survey that the effect of the incendiary bombing on the capital and on the distribution of Japan's factories had been very great, that it had stopped the main productive power of the country, and that it had reduced the will of the people to go on with the war. That admission, made in an interrogation room months after the fire, is closer to what the generals really understood than anything the Imperial General Headquarters put out on the day. The men who ran Japan's air defense knew, in private and after the fact, that the firebombing had broken something essential. They had not said so at the time, because to say so was to admit the war was being lost in the skies over their own capital. There is one more figure whose response that night, and in the days after, has been argued over by historians, and it deserves to be handled with the caution the record demands. The Emperor, Hirohito, was in Tokyo during the raid, sheltering with the Empress in an underground bunker beneath the palace grounds while the eastern wards burned. On the 18th of March, 8 days after the fire, He left the palace and toured the destroyed districts in person, moving through streets reduced to ash and rubble and the smell of death. What that experience did to him is genuinely contested in the historical literature, and an honest account names the disagreement rather than resolving it. One historian has argued that the tour of the ruins convinced Hirohito that Japan had lost the war. Another has written that the raid had little effect on him at all. A third has concluded that the emperor went on supporting the continuation of the war well into the summer of 1945, months after he had walked through the ashes of his capital. The record does not allow a clean answer, and anyone who offers you a confident one is filling a gap the sources leave open. What is certain is that Japan did not surrender in March. The fire that killed 100,000 people in a single night did not end the war. It would go on for another 5 months, through the firebombing of one Japanese city after another, until the atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August. The official response to the raid extended beyond words into action, and the action confirms how the command privately judged its own failure. Within the 10th Air Division, the senior officers responsible for the defense of the Tokyo sky on the night of the 10th were largely removed, sacked or reassigned as punishment for what had happened. A command does not dismiss its own leadership for an outcome it considers acceptable. The dismissals were an admission written in personnel orders rather than in speeches. Yet remarkably little was done to actually strengthen the defense of the capital afterward. Only about 20 aircraft were sent to reinforce the 10th Air Division, and even those were pulled away 2 weeks later when no further major attack came. From April onward, the Japanese deliberately reduced their attempts to intercept the American raids at all, choosing to hoard their aircraft for the invasion they believed was coming rather than spend them defending cities they could no longer protect. The night fighter force never became effective. Many Japanese cities were left with no anti-aircraft protection whatsoever. The command had looked at the arithmetic of the 10th of March, the handful of bombers downed against the scale of the destruction, and concluded that the sky over Japan could not be held. It was the correct conclusion. It was also, for the people in the cities still to be burned, a sentence. There is a detail in the conduct of the other Japanese cities that proves how badly Tokyo's defenders had misread the threat beforehand. In the nights immediately after the 10th of March, the Americans turned the same tactics on Nagoya, on Osaka, on Kobe, and on Nagoya again, burning out tens of square miles in the space of a little over a week, until the bomber command temporarily ran out of incendiary bombs and had to pause the campaign. The death tolls in those follow-on raids, though terrible, were far lower than in Tokyo, often fewer than 10,000 in each. Part of the reason was that the authorities in those cities, having finally grasped from Tokyo's destruction how lethal a firebombing truly was, had made better preparations and ordered earlier evacuations. The lesson Tokyo's command had refused to learn from a contained fire at Nagoya in January, the rest of Japan learned in a single night in March, written in the bodies of the capital. The price of the misjudgment was paid first and most heavily by the city that had been most confident it could cope. The number of the dead has never been fixed with certainty, and the reasons it cannot be fixed are themselves part of the story. After the raid, the recovery teams counted and recorded just under 80,000 bodies. The city's own director of health estimated the dead at around 83,000, with nearly 41,000 more injured. The Tokyo Fire Department put the figure higher, at around 97,000 killed. The Tokyo Metropolitan Police believed that more than 120,000 had been killed or wounded. After the war, the American Bombing Survey settled on roughly 88,000 killed and just under 41,000 injured, and noted that the majority of the dead were women, children, and the elderly, the people least able to run. Historians have generally placed the toll between 90,000 and 100,000, while some have argued for figures considerably higher, one writer putting the dead at 200,000. The reasons for the uncertainty are concrete. Whole families and whole communities were wiped out together, with no one left to report them. Records were burned in the fire that killed the people they listed. Many of those who died in the rivers and canals were swept out to sea and never recovered. The collection of bodies was halted 25 days after the raid, long before the work was truly done. Most of the recovered dead were buried in mass graves without ever being identified. A death toll that cannot be counted is its own kind of testimony to the completeness of what happened. Beyond the dead, the police recorded that 267,000 buildings were destroyed, a quarter of all the buildings in Tokyo, and that just over 1 million people were left homeless in a single night. The American command judged the operation a clear success. The reports from the crews and the reconnaissance photographs taken on the 10th showed the scale of the destruction, and the head of the Army Air Forces sent LeMay a message of congratulation, telling him the mission proved his crews had the courage for anything. The command's own analysis of why the raid had worked so completely pointed to 3 things: the concentration of the bombing on one compact area, the short span of time over which the bombers struck, and the strong wind that turned 1,000 separate fires into one. In the weeks that followed, more than 1 million people streamed out of Tokyo, the great majority of them taken in by the surrounding prefectures. The damage and the flight of workers from the city badly disrupted the Japanese war economy, which had been the point. Some of the refugees who had lived in the poorest parts of the burned wards found themselves housed for the first time in wealthier districts, and the contrast in living conditions stirred resentment that spilled over into unrest in places. The firebombing of Japanese cities, refined on the night of the 10th of March, became the standard method of the campaign for the rest of the war. Tokyo was hit with incendiaries again and again over the following weeks, with the last major fire raid on the city coming on the night of the 25th into the 26th of May. By then, more than half of Tokyo had been burned out, and more than 4 million people had been driven from their homes, and the Bomber Command took the city off its target list because there was no longer enough left standing to be worth the effort. By the end of the war, 3/4 of all the sorties the command had flown had been firebombing attacks. The morality of what was done over Tokyo that night has been argued about ever since, and the argument has only sharpened with the decades. The raid killed and destroyed on a scale beyond the atomic bombing of either Hiroshima or Nagasaki, and beyond the firebombing of Dresden, and it is regularly cited alongside Dresden in the criticism of Allied bombing. Many historians and writers regard the deliberate targeting of a civilian district as something that should never have been done, and one philosopher has called the raid unnecessary and disproportionate. Other historians argue that the failure of precision bombing left the American command with no other tactic capable of damaging Japanese war production, and that the raid, for all its horror, was militarily effective and helped bring a long and bloody war to a faster end. At the time, few in the United States raised any objection at all. The Secretary of War was aware of LeMay's tactics and was troubled by how little public reaction the firebombing of Tokyo provoked. Yet he allowed the operations to continue to the end of the war. Whatever the moral verdict, the military historians have been close to unanimous on one point. The official history of the Army Air Forces judged that the attack fully met the objectives LeMay had set for it, and that the raid and the fire attacks that followed shortened the war. Later historians have described the night of the 10th of March as the moment the American air campaign in the Pacific turned, the point at which months of frustration gave way to the full weight of American industrial power falling on a faltering Japan. Some have argued that the decision to switch from precision bombing to low-altitude area incendiary attacks was the single most important factor in the eventual success of the entire strategic bombing of Japan. The raid was, in that reading, the beginning of the most effective phase of the air war, and the proof that LeMay and his superiors had wanted that the bomber could win campaigns on its own. Both positions in a later debate are held by serious people who have studied the same evidence. What is not in dispute is the result on the ground. The thing the title of this account promised, what the Japanese generals really said, turns out to have a layered answer. On the night itself, through their official organ, they said almost nothing true, only that various places had been set afire. Their state radio called it slaughter bombing, a phrase aimed at the enemy rather than at the truth. Their personnel orders said, by dismissing the officers who had failed, that the defense had been a disaster. And after the war, in the quiet of an interrogation room, with nothing left to protect, they said plainly that the fire had stopped the country's production and broken the people's will to fight on. The most truthful sentence the command ever spoke about the night of the 10th of March was spoken months later, to its enemy, in defeat. What remains today sits in the eastern wards where the fire burned hottest. After the war, the bodies that had been buried in mass graves were exhumed and cremated, and their ashes were gathered into a charnel house in Yokoamicho Park in the Sumida ward, a building that had originally been raised to hold the remains of the 58,000 who died in the Great Earthquake of 1923. The victims of the fire were laid alongside the victims of the quake, two catastrophes a generation apart, sharing one resting place. The hall now holds the ashes of more than 100,000 of the raid's dead, the number whose remains were kept there or claimed by family. And even that figure falls short of the true total, because so many of the dead were never recovered at all. Since 1951, a Buddha service has been held there every year on the 10th of March to mark the anniversary of the raid. In 1990, the Tokyo Metropolitan Assembly named the 10th of March a day of peace for the city. For a long time, there was no major public museum dedicated to the raid. A plan for an official Tokyo Peace Museum was begun in the 1970s and then canceled by the Metropolitan Assembly in 1999, and a memorial called the Dwelling of Remembrance was built instead in Yokoamicho Park, dedicated in March of 2001. The fuller record was preserved by private hands. A group of citizens led by the writer Katsumoto Sato, himself a survivor of the fire as a boy, raised the money to build the center of the Tokyo raids and war damage, which opened in 2002 and remains the main place in Japan where the documents, the photographs, and the testimony of the firebombing are kept and shown. The quietness of the official commemoration has a reason behind it that historians have noted. One scholar of the raids has argued that the Japanese government has preferred to keep the firebombing low in the national memory, because to dwell on it would mean acknowledging that Japan itself had pioneered the bombing of cities in Asia, in China, years before the fire came to Tokyo, and that the comfortable image of Japan purely as a victim of the air war is easier to sustain when the focus stays on the atomic bombs. The fire over the Shitamachi does not fit neatly into anyone's preferred story, which is part of why it has been so often left in the margins. In 2007, a group of survivors and bereaved families went to court seeking compensation and an apology from their own government for its handling of the raid and its aftermath, arguing among other things that it had compensated military victims of the war while leaving civilian victims with nothing. In 2009, the Tokyo District Court ruled against them. The campaign to win recognition for the civilian dead has continued since. The Sensoji Temple in Asakusa, where so many died in the firestorm, was rebuilt after the war and stands again on its old ground, crowded now with worshippers and visitors who walk over earth that was, for one night, the floor of a furnace. Return, at the end, to the burning cross the Pathfinders drew over the city just after midnight on the 10th of March, 1945. It was an aiming mark, a piece of cold tactical geometry, two lines of fire laid down, so that the bombers behind could fill the space between them. The men who held responsibility for the city beneath it had seen the danger coming and had measured it wrong. They had looked for the enemy in the wrong part of the sky, trusted a fire they had once put out, and called a substantial defense into being on paper that did almost nothing when the night came. When it was over, they told the public that various places had been set afire, and they told the truth only later, and only to the men who had beaten them. The ash settled. The river carried the dead to the sea. The count was never finished. And 80 years on, in a quiet park in the Sumida ward, the ashes of the people who lived under that burning mark still rest in a single house, beside the dead of an older disaster, with a name cut into stone and a service held for them once a year on the morning the fire came. Thank you for staying with this until the end. If what you heard here stayed with you, the other films on your screen carry the story forward. Subscribe if you haven't, and I'll see you in the next one.